Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alina Gilbert. I will be presenting our webinar today on production of documents. What do we actually have to give homeowners? It's an age-old question, isn't it? So before we get started with this, enjoy the Dilbert cartoon while I go through some housekeeping things. So for those of you who have not participated in one of our webinars before, welcome. We're glad you're here. The bulk of your screen should be the PowerPoint. So you should be seeing the big old Dilbert cartoon here. And at the bottom right-hand corner is me. Hello, me, the presenter. And to the left, you should also see little icons, and there is a little like talk bubble with a question mark in there. That is for you to type in questions as we go along. I do save all the questions until the very end, so we will go through those, or as many of those as we can, time permitting. So type your questions in as we go. And like I said, we'll try to get through most of them, if not all of them, at the end of the class. Now, the CMCA credits are going to be automatically generated. This is eligible for 1 credit. They are generated once we receive confirmation of all the attendees from the provider, and the CMCA credit form is going to be emailed to you within the next 24 to 48 hours. So if you don't see that by end of day on Friday, go ahead and give us a call or shoot us an email, and we'll make sure we get another one sent over to you. In the meantime, if you have questions, as far as like the technical piece of this, you're having a hard time hearing, seeing, anything like that, please, instead of typing anything, I want you to email our education coordinator, Summer Sims, at ssims@altitude.law, where you can call her directly at 303-991-2076. And she can help you with the technical side of things, because there's nothing I can do on my end. All right. And you can also contact Summer with any questions about your certificate, your credits, or anything like that. She is happy to help. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, because we've got a lot of ground to cover today. We are going to be talking about primarily Section 317 of Kiowa. Where are the answers? The answers to the question of what do we have to produce? So again, Section 317 of Kiowa speaks to association records, and it was rewritten back in about 2014 or so. So everyone should have a policy on inspection of records. If your policy for your association was not rewritten around 2014 or so, there is a very good chance that it is completely out of compliance with the statute, and you need to have it rewritten. Like I said, the statute, or the Section 317, was completely overhauled in about 2014, and it changed the whole section on what's open to inspection, how it's to be inspected, timing, all that good stuff. So take a look at your policies, make sure they were adopted after or right around 2014, late 2013, something like that. And of course, the governing documents also play a role in figuring out what documents we have to present to the homeowners or make available to the homeowners. So with Section 317, there are 4 themes. I couldn't think of a good word to put in there. I wanted to say there are 4 sections, but then it didn't make sense because of 4 sections in Section 317. There's too many sections. But there's 4 basic themes in Section 317. You've got, the first thing is the exclusive list of records for the purposes of document production. Okay, so 317 says, here is a list of documents that are going to be considered the sole records for the purposes of production to homeowners. Right? Then there's a section that says, despite this list of documents that have to be produced, here is a list of documents that may be withheld. And so that can carve out some exceptions in the list that must be produced. And then the next section is, Here are records that must be withheld. So even if they were named in the first part as being a record that's subject to production, if it then says, but wait, you have to withhold some or all of this record in this other section, then you have to, right? So it's a little bit convoluted, but it is what it is. So, and then the last part is going to be general conditions and rules of production, which we'll cover last. So let's go ahead and get started, because the list is long, this exclusive list, and it's section 317, subsection 1 is where this list is kept. And I put it in there because I know that there's some of you who are going to want to read this in the statute, and you're going to say, where do I find this? So here's where you find it. Okay, so the first thing that it says is, in addition to this list, it's whatever documents are identified in the declaration and the bylaws as being records that homeowners are entitled to see. Okay, so you always want to take a look at your governing documents first before saying no to a specific document, because if your documents list it, they have to be produced unless they fall under the you must withhold provision. The other thing to note with section 317 is it does apply to all communities, regardless of when the community was created. So it doesn't matter if you're managing or sitting on the board of a community from the 1980s, they're subject to this. So keep that in mind. So receipts and expenditures affecting the operation and administration of the association. Pretty broad, right? It's pretty broad, and almost, anything is going to fit under that. That's some sort of a financial record of the association, showing receipts for something we've paid, or a list of expenditures that the association has made with respect to keeping the association running. Okay. Claims for construction defects and amounts received pursuant to settlement. So, first of all, claims for construction defects. What exactly do we have to produce? If you're in the middle of a construction defect lawsuit, it doesn't mean you are required to produce every single little piece of paper that is currently being shuffled back and forth with respect to litigation. In fact, you probably don't want to do that. A lot of that's going to be attorney-client privileged. And so what do we mean by claims? I would argue, and I would say, if you produce a copy of the complaint that has a list of kind of all the claims of action, or a copy of the initial demand letter that was sent by the construction defects attorney to the developer, that would be enough, because that sets forth the different claims that the association is asserting or will assert against the developer. Okay, you don't have to produce a whole lot of anything else, especially if you're midstream litigation. And then if the litigation is over, or it's settled, you also have to let homeowners know, if they ask, this is if they ask, amounts received pursuant to a settlement, or amounts awarded if there was an award of damages. Okay. Minutes of meetings, and that's board meetings and membership meetings, any meetings that you take minutes at, could even be committee meetings. They're all open. Now, some of you, as we're going through this, may be saying, well, how long do I have to keep these things? And I will tell you, if I don't tell you otherwise, if there's nothing written next to this item, it's really, you're going to have to keep it indefinitely. We would not recommend getting rid of or destroying records that don't have a time on them. And some of them will have a time, but a lot of them don't. Actions, or a record of all actions that are taken by a board or the committee outside of a meeting. And then the next bullet point kind of goes hand in hand, and that's written communications between directors. And I think it's going to apply to committee members that are directly related to actions outside of a meeting. So what's an action outside of a meeting? It's essentially when your board votes via email on a particular matter, and it doesn't vote on it at a meeting. Now, even if you do a vote outside of a board meeting, you do an email vote, and then you go to the meeting and then you ratify that decision, This does not negate this requirement that the record of all actions taken by a board outside of a meeting still has to be produced, okay? So ratification isn't going to make this null and void. And what is a record of all actions taken? Well, it's the actual vote. It's the email vote that was taken. And then in addition to that, the next bullet is written communications between the directors that are directly related to the action outside of a meeting. What does that mean? Okay, so what it means is, let's say you as a board are going to do a vote by mail, by email about whether or not to retain a contractor. Now, normally we would recommend, decisions be made in meetings, and then, actions outside of a meeting be more of a exception rather than a rule. But let's say, for whatever reason, you're doing this vote via email. And prior to voting, there's an exchange of emails between the board members, the manager, and there's stuff in there, you kind of digress about Betty down the street and how horrible she is, and Bob on the other side of the community and how he's like not pulling his weeds and things like that. And then you vote. And it's all part of this one email string that eventually gets to the voting part. So that is written communications between the directors that are directly related to the action outside of a meeting. And if somebody asks you for that email chain, you have to produce the entire chain. Okay? Because it's also a record of action taken by a board outside of a meeting. And there's probably going to be stuff in that chain that the board doesn't want owners to see. So we're going to see later that emails between board members can be excluded from production in most cases. But in this case, it cannot if it's part of your email chain with respect to an action outside of a meeting. So what's the best practices here? Best practices is when you actually go to vote on something via email, start a new email chain. Start the new email chain so that the rest of those emails aren't part of the record and you don't have to produce it. Okay? So be very careful in what you put in your emails, especially when you are voting outside of a board meeting. All right. But wait, there's more. All right. Membership list. So what do you need in your membership list? You need a physical mailing address for every owner. So that the mailing address is not necessarily their address in the community. It's wherever the association sends notices. So it might be an offsite address, okay? But so that's the address that has to be provided. So you have a name, you have the physical mailing address, and the number of votes. I bet most of you don't put the number of votes in your lists. And I suspect most homeowners don't care if you put the number of votes in your list when you produce it. However, you could always get a stickler or, a law student who says, you have to put the number of votes and you didn't, therefore you violated the statute. So just realize that that is something that the statute requires. So if you're managing or on the board of a timeshare community, you're excluded from this requirement. So yay, give yourself a pat on the back. You don't have to worry about it. But the rest of us do. Okay? So a lot of times I have boards or managers contacting me and they say, well, I don't have a list. Do I have to prepare a list? Well, yeah, you should have a list, and it's your mailing list. It's wherever you mail. How do you know where to send your meeting notices? Don't you have a list somewhere, right? So that's all that is. Okay. Next is the governing documents. Easy peasy. This stuff is usually on the website, right? It's easy to just point them to the website. The declaration, articles, bylaws, rules, policies, resolutions, guidelines, whatever else your boards have adopted, all that stuff is part of the governing documents, has to be produced. But if it's on the website, you can point someone to the website and say it's right there. You have free access to it. All right. Financial statements past 3 years. So here we have a timeline on it, right? So financial statements, and what does that mean? Showing assets and liabilities and results of operations in reasonable detail. Is that the association's budget? Sure, that falls under it. Is it the association's bank reconciliation statements? Sure, that falls under it. Is it the board's reports from the bank? Yeah, that falls under it too. I have a lot of managers and board members who don't want to produce bank statements for some reason. The main reason is that they say, well, we don't want homeowners seeing the association's bank account numbers. Well, Colorado law doesn't look at it that way. Colorado law says, association, you don't do anything to earn your own money. You just take money from the homeowners who are part of the association. So it's their money. Okay, it's not really your money, it's their money. And they are well entitled to know what's happening with their money, what bank accounts it's being held in, if it's being invested, how it's being used, what it's being used on. They are entitled to all that information. And therefore, you have to give it to the homeowners if they are asking for it for the past 3 years. Okay. Tax returns. Yes, they're entitled to tax returns for the past 7 years. The IRS won't go back more than 7 years, and neither should you. We're not done. We're not done. There's more, right? Current amounts of, this was added later on to the statute, current amounts of assessments, extraordinary fees, and charges by the association at the time of unit transfer. So to the extent that there's transfer fees by the management company, record change fees, status letter fees, it doesn't matter if it's, a management company charging the association, because the association is going to come around and charge that back to the owners, right? So you have to disclose that if they are asked. A lot of associations actually put that on their websites. Sometimes they'll do it in other areas where people can just go and print off that information, so they don't have to produce it every single time that someone wants it. But it is something that owners are entitled to ask for and receive. Management company information. Okay, I suspect that's pretty well out there, and that's not an issue. Address and phone number, the management company. Most recent annual report filed with the Secretary of State. So that is something that is on the Secretary of State website that can be found like within 2 minutes by anyone who knows, how to look on the Secretary of State website. It's also, a lot of times associations put that on their website. You don't have to, but it's basically the report that you file every year, or that, your law firm files for the association every year, that basically confirms that the corporation is still in existence and, nothing's changed. Most recent reserve study, if any. So the if any is interesting because that's actually out of the statute. It does say if any. And yet at the same time, we have a mandatory policy that talks about reserve studies and implies really that everyone has to have a reserve study. And then we have this language that says, oh, you have to provide it if you have one. So that's kind of interesting. But if you do have one, if you have done a reserve study and a homeowner wants to see it, they are entitled to see the most recent one. Currently active written contracts, or contracts that have been active in the last 2 years. Okay, let's be clear. This includes the law firm contract. This includes the management company contract. This includes all contracts that the association has entered into with any vendor. And it includes those contracts that are right now active, and we are working off of them. And if they're not active, but they have been active in the last 2 years, it includes those as well. Okay. So hypothetically, let's do an example here. The association decided to change law firms last year. They got a new law firm. Homeowner goes to the board, says, I want to see a copy of the old law firm's legal services contract. And even though it's not active anymore, it's been active in the last 2 years because they just switched attorneys last year. So yes, you would still have to produce a copy of that for the home. All right. We're getting close to being done, okay? I promise. So records of board actions to approve or deny architectural changes. And this is really funny because you're going to see that some of the excluded documentation pertains to architectural changes and requests. But as far as we're concerned here, records of board actions. So would that be, board member voting, that type of stuff with respect to approving or denying a change. Now it says board of directors, but in cases where you have an architectural committee, which is a lot of cases, this extends to the architectural committee as well. So it's not just the board, but it's your ARC as well. Ballots and proxies associated with a membership vote, any membership vote for 1 year after the vote. So what does this include? This includes our elections. This includes if we're doing a mail ballot to vote on a declaration amendment. This includes votes on special assessments. Basically anything you use a ballot or proxy for. Now, there have been situations where homeowners got really upset because a copy of their ballot was given to someone because they requested it and they had their name on it, because the only ballots that are secret are typically the contested director elections, right? Everything else, we make people sign their name and put their address on there. Why? Well, because the Nonprofit Act says ballots have to be signed. So that's why we do it. So then the question is, is that a violation of privacy to do that? Well, the answer is no, because the statute says that ballots and proxies associated with any membership vote must be made available to anyone who requests them, or homeowner requests them, within a year, for the first year after. After the year, you can say no. Okay. Next, written communications to all owners generally for the last 3 years. Okay, so what is that? That's basically any kind of a blast mailing that the association does that goes to every single homeowner. It's your meeting notices, it's your newsletters, it's your, here's a copy of our budget notice, anything that goes out to all owners. And that's all it is. It's not communications that go out to some owners, but not other owners. Like, hey, you got to fix your door. Hey, you got to paint your house. Hey, you're delinquent in assessments. Those are specific communications that go to specific owners. They're not going to all owners in general. Okay. Names, mailing addresses, email addresses of directors. So this was added also later on, and this is something that a lot of board members had, and I think still have, concerns with, because they don't want their mailing addresses given out. Again, mailing addresses is not necessarily your address in the community. It is where your notices get sent. So mailing addresses, email addresses. For those of you who have been around for a while, you've probably noticed the shift come 2014 when this all came about, for board members to start creating, or management companies to create for their board members, generic email addresses, right? Board president at abchoa.com. We see those. And what happens is those can get transferred regardless of who is in that board president position. It just goes to whoever is sitting in that position. So it's not a personal email. It's a generic email address, but it's an email where the board president can get, can receive emails. Same thing, with all the other board members, board member at abchoa.com. I've seen some creative stuff. But not all board members do this. There's actually, I still see quite a few board members that keep their personal email addresses. And that always boggles me, because I guess they're just not experienced getting negative emails from upset people at their personal email, or it hasn't bothered them that they've gotten it. But there's still a whole bunch of them out there that keep their personal email address. All right, actually, hold on, let me go back one. So this is it. We're at the end of this list. Okay, so this is that exclusive list of all the records. So now it's time to go through and cover some exceptions to the rules we just read. And these are records that may be withheld. So this is permissive. This is at the board's discretion as far as may be withheld. It's not up to the homeowner, it's up to the board. So what are these things? This list is just one page, so it's definitely not as long as the other one. So contracts, leases, can't talk, bids that are currently under negotiation. So those are contracts that have not yet been signed, contracts that are redlined, that you're negotiating through the attorney or not the attorney or whoever, right? These are the unsigned contract. These are the bids. This is all the stuff, like the information gathering stuff when it comes to contracts. So I have oftentimes seen homeowners demand copies. I want to see copies of all the bids for our landscaping because I want to make sure that you actually got 3 bids like you were supposed to, board. You guys have seen those, right? So you don't have to produce the bids. And in fact, the statute says you don't have to produce them. So my recommendation generally is, it's up to the board whether or not to produce these things. My recommendation is to err on the side of caution and not produce them, but also the most important thing about this stuff is to be consistent. Courts hate it when boards are inconsistent. So let's say I'm going to produce a bid for this owner, but not for that owner. Or I'm going to produce a bid for this type of contract, but not for that type of contract. That's the first thing that's going to get people, homeowners, talking and getting very suspicious. Well, why aren't you producing it for this contract? What are you hiding, right? You produced it for this one. Why not that one? Or why did you give it to Joe but not to Bob? So these are the types of things that cause people to question the board. Now, certainly if you say we're not producing it, yes, somebody could get upset and say, hey, you're hiding something. They could still do that, but at least if you're consistent across the board, that's not something they can pin on you and say, well, what are you hiding in this case and not in that case, right? Because we consistently do not produce these documents and in accordance with what the statute allows us to do. Attorney-client privilege communication. This is another one, and generally attorneys will not recommend that you produce attorney-client privilege communication to homeowners. Once you agree to produce it or you've produced it, the privilege is waived, which means it doesn't exist for that particular issue, which means homeowners can ask additional questions, can ask for additional documentation between the association and the attorneys with this particular issue. What's the problem with producing that? Well, the problem is this. Most of the time, when we attorneys send you communication, we don't just say, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do this. We typically will give you a whole big spiel, right? And we're like, hey, you can do this, but here are some risks, and here's a different way of interpreting the documents, and this could mean that, it could mean this. Someone can challenge it on this basis or that basis. Well, guess what the homeowners are going to see when they get a copy of that, if they get a copy of that. They're going to see all the things that the attorney said are risky, perhaps ill-advised, or perhaps things to consider that the board did not do. Or that the board, because they're always going to have risks associated with something, but the homeowners aren't going to see it as advice that it, kind of tell you here's all the things that can go wrong. They're going to see it as the attorney said you shouldn't do it because it's risky, and you did it anyway. So we don't ever want to put a board or a manager in that kind of a position. And so, be careful with disclosure of attorney-client privilege communications. And that really includes contract review letters from the attorneys. I have now started sending emails with my contract review letters to everyone saying, hey, this is attorney-client privilege. Don't give this to the contractor. We can produce a non-privileged letter that goes straight to the contractor that doesn't have all this other attorney-client privilege stuff in it, summarizing our changes. So don't produce that to the contractor. Opinion letters, same thing, attorney-client privilege. Be careful with those. Disclosure of information in violation of the law. In my personal opinion, in case anyone cares, I think this needs to be under must withhold as opposed to may withhold, because what is this really saying? Oh, you may decide to violate the law and disclose something against the law? I don't understand. So to me, this is, you have to withhold. You can't disclose things that are a violation of law. What violates the law? Well, something that's truly subject to privacy laws, things like medical records, but those are already listed later on, and you'll see that, okay? Records of executive session, amazing, yay. So how many times have you wondered, can we take minutes in executive session? How do we have a record of what the board decides if it decides something in executive session? How do we have a record of what was discussed? Well, and in the past, we would have said, yeah, you can take minutes, but that's part of your minutes, and that goes to the homeowners if they want to see it, or if you're posting it on your website. Can't exclude it, it's part of your minutes. Well, now it says we can exclude it. So what's the key here? The key is you want to make it a separate document then. If you're going to do minutes or records or something with respect to an executive session, your regular minutes only need to say that board went into executive session at this time to talk about this general thing, and then it came out of executive session at this time. That's all your regular minutes have to say. And then if you choose to take minutes during the session, then you can have a separate document that specifically has the information about what occurred during the executive session. So if a homeowner requests copies of minutes, that's something that isn't automatically going to go with the minutes, or it's something that doesn't get posted to the website. Okay. Records pertaining to individual units other than those of the requesting owner. So this is like a lot of that stuff that we talked about earlier, like communication that goes to less than all the homeowners. So demand letters, violation notices, ledgers, right? Be careful with this, because as we're going to move on to the next session, it talks about what must be withheld. And I am going to argue that almost everything that pertains to an individual unit must be withheld under that section. So I know this says may, but the safest option is do not disclose anything to a homeowner about any other unit, any other documents pertaining to that unit. We'll see why in a minute. Okay, so then these are the records that must be withheld. Okay. Architectural drawings, plans, designs, etc., unless, look at this big unless, approved by the owner of the same. So the owner of the drawings, plans, and designs is not the homeowner. Okay, it's the architect, it's the designer. Homeowners are not going to be the owners of these documents. So here's a little secret for you. I kind of messed with you a little bit because this architectural drawings bullet point was actually in the may withhold in the statute, and I moved it to the must. Why did I move it to must? Well, because it says you can't disclose it unless you have approval. How is that a may withhold? That's a must withhold. And so I just figure it's easier to group the must withholds. I probably should have put the, in violation of the law under must as well, because that doesn't make sense in the may withhold column. But so this is in the may withhold, but again, you can't do it without approval. So how is that a may, right? And in most cases, the association doesn't have any connection with the architect that designed something for a homeowner, right? We're not going to reach out to the architect and get permission. We're just going to say, no, we're not authorized to give you these drawings for the gazebo that the association approved for your neighbor. Sorry, not happening. Personnel and salary information. This really is for associations that have employees. Remember, your managers, your attorneys, none of them are employees. They are contractors, independent contractors. So this does not mean you can say, I'm not giving you the management agreement because it's personnel or it's salary information. No, contractors get paid via contract. They don't get salaries. Only employees are going to get your salaries. And they're not personnel, they're contractors. So don't get confused by this language. A lot of times a question comes up. All right, hold on a minute, Alina. We have to give homeowners access to all our financials, but now you're saying salary information we can't give them. And so how does that all work? Because we have that in our financials, right? How many of you are thinking that? And I can't really raise your hands, but I'm envisioning a whole bunch of you raising your hands going, yeah, what about that? So what many associations do and what we generally recommend is, to the extent you have that information, like for example, in the budget, we will recommend you basically combine salaries, benefits, any other perks that, that personnel get, and put it under one line item. And it could be, employee distributions or whatever. And that way, homeowners can see it. They can see the total dollar amount of what you're spending on your employees, but they don't know how much you're spending on each, or how much is salary versus how much is benefits and things like that. So there's a way to do it where you're not disclosing the actual individual salary information and things like that. Medical records. Okay, so I mentioned that earlier. That's something that cannot be disclosed, not just under Kiowa, but under other laws, right? Medical records are extremely privileged, they're extremely private. And why would you as an association have medical records? Well, you would most likely have medical records if you have an owner in the community who says, I am disabled, I need an accommodation, right? I need a modification. And you say, well, we can't see the disability, we need something from a medical provider, establishing that you have a disability and that this connects to your disability. And you get something from the medical provider, and guess what? That is a medical record, even if it's from the person's masseuse, saying, yes, they have this, muscle spasm, and they need this. Those are all medical records and they cannot be disclosed. So be very careful with what you do with those kinds of records and how you keep them. And then here's the kind of the last, and I think of this as a catch-all, account information of members. And then it gives us some examples, but this is not an all exhaustive list. It doesn't say these are the only examples. It says it includes bank accounts, phone numbers, email addresses, driver's license, and social security numbers. My position on this has always been, and not all attorneys agree, I will tell you that right off the bat, but my position has always been each owner has an account with the association. How much I owe the association is part of my account. And therefore, things like ledgers should not and cannot be disclosed because they fall under this provision. Again, not everyone agrees with me, but that's how I feel. But regardless, you don't have to produce them, and I generally do not recommend you ever produce them. Let's talk about phone numbers and email addresses because that's kind of big. There's an unless, right? Unless approved in writing by the owner. So how many of you create homeowner directories for your communities that have email addresses and phone numbers in there? If you do that, and you do not have a piece of paper or something saved in which the owner specifically said, yes, you can print this information, or check the box that said, yes, I consent to you printing this information, you have just violated the law and you have disclosed information that you are not allowed to disclose. So please, 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 before you guys create any sort of homeowner directories, make sure that your form is just names and addresses unless you've got something in writing. Any homeowner who approves it, you can put their information in. So you might have some sort of a directory that has some people's emails, but not others. That's okay. It can be that way. Be very careful also with mass emails. A couple of times have seen managers, it's not on purpose, right? But they've done it. They've emailed like the community and they forget to hide the email addresses so everybody can see everyone else's email. Very bad. Don't get stuck with that kind of a situation. So be very careful. Okay, so this is the list of what must be withheld. So now we can move on and talk about the general conditions and rules with respect to document inspection in general. And perhaps this is not the more important part, but I think this is kind of the more sometimes complicated part of what we can and can't do, conditions and things like that. So first bullet point is who can request documents? It's not just the owners, okay? It's owners or designated representatives. How do we know if someone's a designated representative? They will have a written document that says, this is my representative. So that could be a renter. If a renter contacts you and says, hey, I'm going to email you a copy of something from the owner that says I'm their representative and I want to see these documents, you can't ignore that renter. Is a designated representative, they would be entitled to see those documents. So be careful when you do get requests from someone other than the owner, because the appropriate response is, please forward to us any written designation of you as the owner's representative. And if they say what, I mean, I think that kind of answers the question. Associations can require homeowners to submit a written request for whatever documents they want to see, and we can require that they describe those documents with reasonable particularity. You love that language, don't you? Created by legislators who are, most of them are lawyers. Yes, lawyers love their words. So reasonable particularity of the documents sought. So what does that mean? Well, one, it means we can say, hey, if you want to see records, you need to submit something in writing. Does it mean we can require they fill out a form? Well, no, we can't make them fill out a form. We can say, here's a form for your convenience. Please, use this. But if they choose to send you an email saying, these are the documents I want, we can't ignore that, okay? So what's reasonable particularity? It's kind of like you know it when you see it, right? If it's something that says, I want copies of all association records for the past 12 months, I'm going to say that's not very particular, right? If it's something like, I want to see all financials of the association, not real particular. So again, we can require reasonable particularity. So in other words, we need to know what they're asking us for. We need to be able to say, what documents fall under this request. Timing. So homeowner has to give us at least 10 days from their request to produce, or the documents may be produced at the next board meeting if it occurs within 30 days of the request. Make sense? So you guys, you get the request, the written request, you got 10 days to make those documents available to the requesting owner. Or you can say, hey, our board meeting is in 25 days. Here's the date. Please show up and we will have boxes for you to look through, while we're meeting. So those are the options as far as timing goes. 10 days, board meeting, if within 30 days, or if the homeowner says, can you get them to me in 20 days, then obviously we can rely on their request and get it to them within 20 days. We can limit inspection if they're coming to us to look at documents to reasonable business hours. So that means, no weekends, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, things like that, not during the lunch hour. We can do that. So here's a biggie. We cannot condition inspection on a proper purpose. So what does that mean? It means we can't ask them, why do you want these documents? Okay? We can't. We're not allowed to anymore. We used to be able to. And then it changed. Why did it change? Well, it changed because there were quite a few boards out there who would say, why do you want to see the financials? Homeowner would say, well, I think you're embezzling money. The board would say, well, that's not a proper purpose because we're not embezzling. So no, you don't get the records. I bet some of you have seen that happen. Well, guess what? That is a proper purpose, right? Because as an owner, I'm entitled to see where the money goes. I may be wrong that you're embezzling, but I'm entitled to see where my money's going. I'm entitled to confirm for myself the money's being spent according to the documents and that it's not being embezzled. I'm entitled to do that. And you as a board member can't tell me no just because because you're insulted by me saying I think you're embezzling. So, once something gets the ear of a legislator, eventually makes its way into one of these kind of statutes. So we can't condition on a proper purpose, and we can't ask them what the purpose is. Here's another biggie. Owners have a right to receive documents electronically upon request if they are available that way. So to the extent a homeowner says, hey, can you email me copies of bank statements for the last 12 months, and we have them all saved in the system, yeah, we're going to have to email those to him or her. Okay, because they can tell us, I want it by email. Now, if they're not saved electronically and we have to go and scan them and, create PDF documents, we'll talk about that in a minute, because we can still charge them for the cost associated with doing that. Okay, but if we don't already have them scanned, hypothetically, you could say, hey, they're not available because they're not in an electronic format right now, and we don't have to convert them. All right. By the way, this meme is hilarious. I don't know why I put it in there, but it made me laugh. Okay, enough of that, right? Let's move on. More conditions. So we don't have any obligation to compile or synthesize information for you or documents. So if a homeowner says, give me the March bank statements for the last 10 years, we don't have to go through all the bank statements and pull out the March statement and send that to the homeowner. We don't have a duty to do that. We can give them about 10 years worth of financial, give them boxes and let them sift through it and find it himself. Okay, so we don't have a duty to compile or synthesize information. Give me a chart showing kind of the average monthly expenditure of the association. No, we don't have that. We're not going to synthesize all that information to create a chart for you. Not happening. Records cannot be used for commercial purposes, and the membership list cannot be used for purposes unrelated to the owner's interest as owners, unless approved by the board. So, logical question here is, well, you just said we can't ask them for the purpose, so what the heck is all this, right? And you're right. I didn't write the statute, but it does say this. And so ultimately, if a homeowner uses the membership list as for personal gain, like to send flyers to everyone about his CPA business, and hey, come to me, I'll do your taxes and give you a discount, yeah, that's an improper purpose. And what that means is homeowners have a claim against this homeowner because he violated the statute and he did not, use the membership list for a purpose that was, with respect to his interest as a homeowner. He used it for his personal gain. So yeah, other homeowners could have a claim of action against him, but with the association, I mean, technically, but with the way the enforcement is right now, there's really no teeth for these types of violations, and it wouldn't make any sense. Because the only thing the association could do then with 1137 is what? Send a nastygram, and that would be that. Because once he's done, he's cured it. So not a whole lot for the association to do. Next one is we can impose reasonable charges and collect in advance of producing the documents. What are reasonable charges? So they're costs for labor. This is spelled out in the statute. Costs of materials and costs of processing and mailing. Okay. A couple of examples. Homeowner wants us to email him some financials. We don't have them in the system for whatever reason. We need to scan them. Okay, well, it's going to take someone at the management company an hour to do that. So that's going to be whatever the hourly rate is. If there's any cost associated with, like if we've got internal charges for scanning, like per page or something like that, those can all get charged back. And you can tell the homeowner, okay, so that is going to be $150 and we need to receive it before we send this to you. You can do that. Homeowner wants copies. They're at your office. They're looking through the documents and they give you 20 and they say, I want copies of this. Okay, it's 25 cents a page plus the time it's going to take whoever to stand at the copier, make these for you. So, whatever. It's $50. We need you to give us the money or write us a check now before we do this for you. You can do that. Okay. What you can't do is you cannot have like somebody sitting with this homeowner in the room because you don't trust them with the documents, which we usually don't, right? We don't trust homeowners. We want someone there to make sure they're not stealing anything, destroying anything, pocketing anything, whatever. But that's not something we can charge back for. That's not a cost of production. That's a cost of security. And the statute doesn't say we can charge for security. It says we can only do a reasonable charge for the cost of production. So don't be charging for that. That's something we have to eat, the costs. And finally, associations do not have to answer questions for explanations. How many times have you gotten communications from homeowners and they're like, I want the financials and I want you to explain why the board chose to do it this way instead of this other way that most CPAs use. What on earth made you think that you could do it this way? Well, we don't have to explain that to him. You can if you want to, but you certainly aren't required to provide explanations. Okay? What if the association fails to comply? Well, so here's the deal. So the homeowner, so let's say the homeowner gives you a request, you don't give it to them within 10 days, you don't give it to them within 30 days at a board meeting. So then they can send a formal demand to the association. And it has to be sent by certified mail, return receipt requested, and it has to have a demand in there for the documents. And it also, to the extent that we've said it's going to cost you X dollars, it has to have the payment in there for the cost of production. If we get one of these letters and we still haven't given the documents within 30 days of when that letter is received, then the homeowner is entitled to, well, penalties, $50 a day, but it starts on the 11th business day after we received the very first request. Although it's capped at $500, so I'm not even sure why they put that in there because it's only 10 days worth. But it can be higher if the homeowner can prove actual damages sustained as a result of non-production. But that would have to be proven where? In court. So the homeowner would have to sue. Okay? Now, the other issue with that is if the homeowner sues, the judge could say, yes, association, you owe this homeowner all these damages. Oh, and by the way, HIWA entitles them or the prevailing party to an award of legal fees. So the association can end up spending a lot of money and paying a homeowner a lot of money for a failure to produce. And so the safest option is just do it. Just give them what they're entitled to have. A couple of problem areas, and then I think we can move almost to questions. A lot of times you can get requests for documents that don't fall under anything that we just talked about, engineering reports, recommendations, who knows what else. And that's okay. And, most of the time that confuses people. And they're like, well, what do I do with this? Are they entitled to this? The short answer is if it's not on the list of the documents, the exclusive list of documents, then it's not subject to production, period, end of story. You don't have to produce it legally. Might you want to produce it in some cases? Sure, maybe an engineering report is something you want the homeowners to see to help them understand the work that's about to happen on the building. You could still produce it if you want to, but the key is you don't have to. Okay, if it's not on the list, it's not a document subject to production to homeowners. Demands for explanations and justifications. We just talked about that. Don't have to provide that. Threats of legal action. Don't let that spook you because, nowadays we have homeowners threatening legal action all the time. They get attorneys to send demand letters and threaten legal action. And half the time, the attorneys don't know what they're talking about because they're not HOA attorneys. They haven't really read the statute and they don't know what's required. So don't let that scare you into giving documents you don't have to give. Obviously, you get any kind of a threat of legal action, you get a letter from an attorney, you're going to go to the association's legal counsel and let them handle it, right? Continued demands for the same thing. I cannot tell you how many times boards kind of go down this spiral where they give the homeowner the documents that were asked for, but the homeowner isn't happy because he doesn't like what they say. So they're like, start asking for the same thing, but in a different way, right? And each time you're like, we already gave that to you. And you're like, no, you didn't. Well, at some point, you got to stop the spiral and say, we're done. Unless you're asking for something we haven't given you yet, we're done. We're not communicating with you anymore on this. So don't get caught in that trap. And then the documents that don't exist, that kind of goes hand in hand with requesting the same thing over and over again. A lot of times they want documents that don't exist. Maybe they should exist, but they don't. Maybe they're minutes from 5 years ago that got lost in the shuffle when management switched. Happens, right? But they don't exist. So we can't recreate something like that. We don't know. We weren't there. We don't know what they said. So no matter how many times you ask for it, I've had to write letters to attorneys representing homeowners saying, no matter how many times you're asking for this, no matter how you choose to describe this, it's not going to make the document magically poof appear. It doesn't exist. So don't get caught up in that spiral either. May withhold versus must withhold. We talked about that as well. And finally, legal action subpoenas. I can't stress this enough. Just because a document is not subject to homeowner inspection and copying does not mean it cannot be subpoenaed. Okay, so all those emails with the board members, all those things that we can withhold, such as bids and things like that. Guess what? Oh, and executive session records. Guess what? They're all subject to production if there's a lawsuit. So be careful and be mindful of what you put in those documents. Just because we don't have to give it to the homeowners now doesn't mean they're not going to see the light of day. They very well may. So just keep that in mind as well. Before I hit the next slide, it's my funny slide. I apologize. I hope it doesn't offend any of you, but I thought it was hilarious. So I'm just going to share it with you. And if you're angry with me, I'm sorry, but it's hilarious. I hope you are all laughing a lot. All right. I'm going to try and get to as many questions as I can. I apologize. We only have 4 minutes because there was a lot to cover. Just to confirm, you do not have to provide unsigned contracts. Yes, that is absolutely correct. Actually, hold on. I think I'm starting at the wrong end. Okay. Email votes have to be unanimous, correct? Not necessarily. It really is going to depend on what the bylaws say, because the bylaws, if they say it has to be unanimous, it does. If they don't require unanimity, it doesn't have to be. Okay, the Nonprofit Act says that if your bylaws don't require unanimity, it can be the same number that you would need for a vote at the meeting, so majority of quorum. So it's not necessarily unanimous. But we are not supposed to share owner information unless owners have provided permission. Again, I don't recommend we share information about other owners at all. The exception being, like I said, email addresses, phone numbers, if they've given us permission. But things like ledgers and letters, you know what? Let the homeowners give those out themselves if they want someone else to see it. I don't want the association being the party who does that. Okay. Sorry, so this question says, so the financials are some of the documents we have to hand over if asked by a homeowner. Does that include delinquency log, since that is now considered private information and can only be discussed in executive session? Right. So again, this goes back to owners or records of owners, right? And we're not giving out records of owners. So you can have a dollar amount showing the total outstanding delinquencies in the association, but you can't do it unit by unit. Are homeowner lists with phone numbers, email addresses to be maintained confidential by the board? Well, if the association has those lists, like if homeowners have provided that information to you but have not specifically in writing said you can share it, then yes, those cannot be shared. They have to be confidential. I understand you need to keep notes when in executive session. However, I also know these are discoverable. That's right. So what advice can you give on notes in executive session? Well, honestly, minutes are intended to only document decisions of the board. So ultimately, if you're not making decisions in executive session, my recommendation would be you not keep notes. If the board is making decisions, then you do motion, second, and vote. And that's all you would do. So to the extent that the board's approving accounts to go over to collections, motion, second, vote, next. That would be my recommendation. Sorry, I'm kind of going, we only have 1 minute. Okay, so real quick, for those of you who, if I don't get to your question, my email address is on there. Feel free to email me with questions. I will try to respond to all of them as soon as I can. It may not be for a day or two, but I will try to respond. So I apologize if I didn't get to everyone. Can a board member request personnel or salary information from the management company? Awesome question. And I'm going to just get on a soapbox for 2 minutes and we're done. Management company does not get to say what board members get to see and not see. The board members are the corporation. They are the association. They are the body that runs the association and makes decisions. It's not the manager. So it's not that the board has to ask the manager for this information. All the information that the manager has to be made available to the board, okay? Board members are not treated as homeowners when they're wearing their board member hat. And any documents that we just talked about, those are all open to the board members. Once they're off the board, then it's a different story. But while they're on the board, they are entitled to see whatever association documents the association has, regardless of whether those documents are open to inspection by homeowners. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to let everyone go. Again, I'm really sorry I didn't get to everything, but please feel free to email me. And thank you so much for joining me. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.